I'm pleased to welcome Linda Greenhouse to Politics and Prose. Greenhouse is Joseph Goldstein Lecturer in Law at Yale Law School and a contributing op-ed writer for the New York Times. In 1998, she received a Pulitzer Prize in Journalism for her coverage of the Supreme Court. In Just a Journalist, Greenhouse observes that the definition of neutrality has undergone a major shift. After all, a few years ago, newspapers were agonizing over calling waterboarding torture. Now, major publications don't even blink when they call the President of the United States a liar. Greenhouse answers the inevitable "what happened" with stories from her own personal experience when personal criticism of the president was seen as problematic or even unethical. Greenhouse, a self-proclaimed accidental activist, argues that journalists not only can, but should exercise their rights as citizens and participants in our democracy. Michael Schudson, author of The Rise of the Right to Know, calls Just a Journalist a delightful, engaging book. I like its personal tone and its feisty, argumentative character. Now please join me in welcoming Linda Greenhouse.
Thank you. And thank you to all my old friends who are here and maybe some old enemies, I don't know. But it's always an honor for any writer to come to Politics and Prose. I think I've been here in this position twice before for earlier books, and there's no better place, so I thank them for inviting me. So I'm not going to talk for very long. One of the purposes of this book really was to provoke thought and response. It's gotten some response. If you read the Washington Post, you've probably noticed that. I'd be happy to talk about that. But really, I'd like to invite a conversation about some of these ideas. So even though it's a book about me and my career and so on, you know, I'm not terrifically comfortable talking about myself, and I was wondering how I was going to handle these book events. And then in the New York Times of October 26, you probably read the amazing story about from Africa about the 18 girls who'd been kidnapped by the Boko Haram and were made to wear suicide vests and had managed to escape and not carry out their mission. And it was really an extremely gripping story, and it had one of those page 2 little behind-the-scenes essays by the woman, I assume it's the woman, Dion Searcy, who wrote the story, very interesting and touching. And then she had this sentence that really grabbed me. She says, "As a reporter, my job isn't to take sides, but I couldn't stop myself from believing these girls were heroes." I couldn't stop myself from believing these girls were heroes. And I thought to myself, good grief. I mean, what does she have to apologize for? Why does she have to sound defensive about choosing the side of humanity as opposed to the side of terror and mass murder? You know, and in a way, I mean, this is an extreme variant of what my book is about and what I'd like to talk about, which is sort of, where does that come from? You know, why has journalism, mainstream journalism, become so afraid that somebody might call them out as biased? There's no greater insult in journalism than to call somebody biased. And the contortions that my, I say former profession, but kind of current profession too, have gone through to avoid being called out as biased are quite remarkable, really. And I think it's, you know, those of us who care about the post-truth age and real news as opposed to fake news, you know, all have a stake in trying to understand the source of that and to hold up to the light the sort of norms and habits of mainstream journalism that, in my opinion, disable journalism from fulfilling its highest, really noble purpose, which is providing the information to citizens so that they can act as informed citizens in a democracy. Not to tell them what to think. I mean, now I tell them what to think because I'm an opinion writer, and an opinion column that doesn't express an opinion is a failure. So I tell people what to think all the time, and it's very liberating, and I work hard at it, and I'm grateful for the opportunity. But it seemed to me that as those of you who've read the Washington Post know, that the kind of takeaway from the book so far, and I didn't know, I knew there would be some kind of pushback and some kind of takeaway, but I wasn't sure what it would be. I did not imagine that it would be the fact that I wrote a monthly check, it's still right, a monthly check to Planned Parenthood. I'll just read you a little bit about from the book that explains that perhaps more than the 80 or 100 right-wing blogs that I find when I've Googled myself, things that outlets that I certainly never heard of, and I'm guessing many of you who showed up on this rainy night never heard of them either, but here's just a couple of paragraphs that puts that into some kind of context, talking about some of these controversies. Anyone who knew me would have known my positions on these issues and others. My colleagues at the Times did, long before the public abortion-related controversies. Every year, the publisher solicited employees to authorize a payroll deduction for contributions to United Way. When I worked in New York, I always contributed after checking the list of United Way beneficiaries and seeing that Planned Parenthood was on the list. When I arrived in Washington to join the Washington Bureau, I was surprised. I checked the list and was surprised to find that the local Planned Parenthood affiliate was missing. I called United Way in Washington to ask why. After being passed among several employees, I finally reached someone who told me that the problem was that Planned Parenthood was, quote, controversial. I replied that I didn't see much controversy in curbing the high teen pregnancy rate in the District of Columbia, and that I would henceforth make my own contribution directly to Planned Parenthood. I described this encounter in a letter to Arthur O. Sulzberger, the Times publisher, and posted a copy of my letter on the office bulletin board, urging colleagues to follow my example. If anyone did, they kept that knowledge to themselves. So when I call myself an accidental activist, as I do in this book, what I mean by that, and people say, how can she call herself an accidental activist? She did these actions knowingly. What was accidental about them, about the activism, was that I didn't regard it as any kind of norm-breaking activism, and indeed it wasn't at the time, as I think this incident describes, in that everybody always knew what I was doing. And it was only after the fact, when the fear factor kicked in, that all of a sudden things that had been perfectly well accepted, or at least not controversial, became controversial. And I would have thought that what would have been controversial, I just have to check this in the index, would have been something that a very esteemed and admired journalist in this town, Leonard Downey, said when he retired. And he said the following, which I find remarkable, and I wonder if you also do. So it was well known that Len Downey never voted and believed that reporters, I guess no matter what they were covering, shouldn't vote. And I don't agree with that. I think just because somebody enters the field of journalism, it doesn't mean they park their citizenship at the door and don't exercise the basic right of a citizen, which is, of course, voting. But anyway, this is what Len Downey said upon his retirement. I didn't just stop voting. I stopped having even private opinions about politicians or issues so that I would have a completely open mind in supervising our coverage. I stopped having opinions. And when I read that, I thought, wow, that's a lot more problematic than writing a check to Planned Parenthood. For somebody in a position of authority to not even to deliberately rid his highly intelligent mind of opinion, thinking that that was necessary to do his job, I found both surprising and sad. So what are some of the norms that add to the disabling of the basic mission of telling readers and viewers what they need to know? The famous one is the he said, she said, the two sides to every story, and has been criticized by some eminent people in this room and by many journalism scholars over many years, but still it persists. And And so, what's an example of that? For instance, the voter ID dispute, right? So we notice in recent years, red states have come in with these very stringent voter ID requirements to be able to cast your vote at the polls, requiring kinds of identification that are not easily obtained and are disparately not easily obtained or not easily obtained by people of color, poor people, and so on. I mean, in Connecticut, where I vote now, you have to provide ID, but what you it can be anything. And what I always test the system, and what I bring as my ID is the little postcard that came in the mail telling me where the polling place was, and that's fine. That's absolutely fine. But in Texas, it has to be basically an ID that can only be obtained with a birth certificate. Or I believe it's the case in Texas that you can show your gun permit, but you can't show your driver's license or some weird thing like that. Anyway, so many stories about the voter ID controversy, and it is a controversy. It'll say, supporters of this legislation say this is necessary to prevent fraud at the polls, and opponents of this legislation say there is no such fraud at the polls and the whole thing is just a scheme to keep people from voting. Reader, you decide. Now, we know that to the extent that there's any fraud, any election fraud, other than the Russians, but probably there is election fraud, it's not the kind of in-person fraud that voter ID is supposedly aimed at detecting and deterring. It's not people, I'm not showing up at the polls saying, hello, I'm Melania Trump and I'm here to vote. So we know that there's actually a fact and a fake fact about that, but it's a rather rare story that will tell us that. And in the abortion context, for instance, we know that the TRAP laws, TRAP, which stands for Targeted Regulation of Abortion Providers, these laws that are aimed at shutting down clinics by imposing on them needless requirements that it's known in advance that the clinics cannot meet. A law in Texas that was struck down a summer ago by the Supreme Court, requiring doctors to have admitting privileges and clinics to be retrofitted as little hospitals, that kind of thing. So the proponents of this legislation say that it's for the purpose of protecting women's health. It's not actually true. It's medically proven that these things not only, as the Supreme Court said, not only don't protect women's health, actually endanger women's health by shutting down the majority of abortion clinics in the jurisdiction. But it's a rare story that will say something other than proponents say it's to protect women's health, opponents say it's just a sneaky way of shutting down clinics. Reader, you decide. So that's the he said, she said. Two sides to every story. Well, we all know as thinking people that there are many stories that have more than two sides. There are some stories that have only one side. Torture, for instance. There's really not anything much to argue about. So the notion of the he said, she said, and the two sides is very reductive, but yet, as I say, it's still with us. Another example, and I give a number of examples of these from reading that we've all done in the last couple of years, are various distancing mechanisms that provide a kind of insulation between the reporter and the reader, so that the reporter doesn't have to take ownership of some factual assertion that the reporter actually knows to be true, but you put it in the mouth of somebody else. And you put it in the mouth of somebody with a title like professor. That's very handy. Even if it's not a professor who has any reason to know anything more than what you have told the professor when you called that or emailed that person, but yet there's a title, and this is just a totally persistent meme of journalism. Professor so-and-so said this, instead of just the reporter saying this. And there are a number of organizations that have sprung up. My favorite one that I talk about here is the Criminal Justice Legal Foundation. The Criminal Justice Legal Foundation, which is always the other side of any story about criminal justice. Quote, hundreds of quotes from this one individual. His name happens to be Ken Scheidegger. And I have absolutely nothing against him. He is serving the purpose that journalism evidently needs him to serve. It's a tiny little organization. It has, I think, 3 or 4 employees in Sacramento. It's been around for a long time, and it's basically, its raison d'etre is to be the quote. It's to be the other side of the story. It's not the only one, but it's really it's quite interesting. So this book started as a series of lectures that I was invited to give at Harvard almost exactly 2 years ago. I gave the lectures called the Massey Lectures, and the deal is that this series of 3 lectures are given, and then Harvard University Press will publish a book. So, you know, when I was invited to give the lectures, it's a lecture in the American Studies program at Harvard, so it could have been basically anything. And my first instinct was to do something about the Supreme Court. 3 lectures about the Supreme Court, that's kind of easy and obvious since I've spent 30 years writing about the Supreme Court on a daily basis. But then I thought, you know, it's a chance to dig a little deeper and be a little more personal, which was the origin here. Now, 2 years ago, of course, I started tracking how the 2016 campaign was being covered, because it's very interesting to see how journalism treats statements of various politicians. But I don't believe I mentioned the name of Donald Trump in those lectures in November of 2015. He certainly wasn't on my screen as anything plausible. I was looking more at Carly Fiorina and a few other of the politicians who were playing a little fast and loose, so that when I sat down to turn the lectures into the book a year later, of course it was all Trump all the time. So the whole center part of the book really traces the trajectory of how Trump was covered in the mainstream media, and I found it fascinating. I found it thrilling. You know, first very tentatively, like, what is going on here? And then building up the courage, really, the kind of norm-breaking courage to call him out when he told lies. And what I do in the central part of the book is really, you know, track that with some care. Had a bulging pile of clippings, and it, you know, I think it was, I won't exactly say the dawn of a new day, because I end the book with the question, is this Trump specific, or has this experience kind of changed the DNA of mainstream journalism so that it will outlast Trump? And assuming that we all outlast Trump, will there be a time when journalism cuts politicians the kind of slack that they were cut before? And I'll just end with this observation, because it's not original with me. I quote one of the journalism scholars that I turn to in the book, and I'm not a scholar of journalism. In fact, I never took a journalism course, and so, you know, I've been kind of winging it all these years. But this one scholar pointed out that to cover for a politician who you know is not telling the truth, but the norms of journalism disable you from telling the readers that, by the way, dear reader, this person is not telling the truth, is to do something that journalism prides itself on not doing, which is to defer to power, right? You defer to power if you refuse to call it as you see it, call it as you know it to be. So that's just, you know, something to keep in mind. I guess I should mention one other thing that I discuss in the book. I don't talk a great deal about covering the Supreme Court. As I thought back on things, really the more vivid of my journalistic experiences was covering the New York State Legislature in Albany for 4 years before I came to Washington. It just kind of, my husband and I didn't know each other then, and the times I've talked about the Albany experiences so often that he kind of thinks of it as, you know, my lost golden age of my years in my 20s in the state legislative bureau. But anyway, so I don't talk a great deal about journalism about the court, but I do tell the following, which is this sort of late in my time of covering the court. Of course, the internet was all around us, and the court itself has a pretty good website where anybody who's interested enough can get the opinion down within minutes. You know, when I first started, nobody could have immediate access to the opinion unless they were physically at the Supreme Court and got a copy. In fact, I had to get 2 copies of everything that the court did and send one copy up on a bus overnight in a packet that somebody from the New York office would collect at the Port Authority building on 8th Avenue and bring it back to the editorial board so they could decide a day later what they thought about it. Things were that primitive. But now anyone can get the opinions immediately, can get the transcripts of the arguments the same day as opposed to 2 weeks later, which used to be the case, can get the audio of the arguments every week, can get all the briefs, all the filings, a complete electronic docket so you know the whole procedural history of the case. All that kind of stuff is out there and is available to anybody. So this gave me sort of a crisis, an existential crisis. Like, what is my role? You know, anybody that really cares doesn't need me. And so, like, why am I working so hard? What is the point? And then it occurred to me that the point really is to give context. You don't necessarily get the context from looking at the website, is to explain what that case is doing there, why the court picked this case out of the thousands of other cases it could have picked, to set the country's legal agenda. What are the implications? What's the court up to when there's a decision? What paths didn't the court take that was open to it? What aspects of the case did the court help itself to, even though nobody put that forward in the court? What are the implications of the decision? And all that kind of stuff is something that transcends the knowledge that people can get just by looking at the website. And so once I kind of assimilated that, I felt energized and I felt better about it, and I kept doing it. So with that, I'm going to stop and invite your questions or pushback or critiques or whatever. So thank you very much. Okay, somebody has jumped the line. Okay, sure.
Hi, thank you very much for that. It sounds as if you're describing that reporters or journalists are press release re-releasers, and that they think their assignment is to report or just replay Trump, rather than the assignment is, as you just said, to put it in context and say, Trump said X, Y, Z, and so I did the research as a journalist to now make the story about the subject, the content. Is that sort of what I'm hearing from what you're saying is sort of getting lost and it's just press release?
No, I didn't mean to leave that implication. In fact, I think the coverage is by the mainstream media is robust and pretty great currently. So what I'm trying to track was how did it get so good? So I'm not. My premise is not your premise.
Hi. 2 questions. One is, you think, and you talk about in the book, the fact that the reason that what you call journalism or journalists have become defensive is because there's another school of journalism that has come up on the right that has accused what we always think of as journalism as being liberal journalism, and there's this whole other side, attacks from journalists on Fox News, other right-wing sources. And the second question is completely unrelated. How do you think Gorsuch will change the Supreme Court?
How do I think?
Gorsuch. You knew somebody had to ask you.
No, I don't think that the habits that I criticize here are related to the rise of right-wing media, because they go much further than that.
Okay.
In fact, there's some scholarship that, and I don't know whether I believe this or not, but I found it provocative, that says that the norm of objectivity was actually a management tool to control uppity denizens of the newsroom. I don't know. You can decide what you think about that. What do I think Gorsuch is going to do to the Supreme Court? As I've written, my fear about Gorsuch when he was nominated, when he was confirmed, is that his kind of professional trajectory was so much like that of the Chief Justice that he would be a sort of force multiplier for the Chief Justice's most conservative instincts. But based on his behavior as the junior justice, based on what he made of the 13 cases that he heard argument for in his first 2 weeks on the court, when joining a court with a collective tenure of 140 years, and he wrote a bunch of opinions that basically told them all where to go.
Yep.
I think it's just as likely that, as I wrote in that column, that he's going to get on the Chief Justice's nerves. And
Good.
maybe, I think he already has, and maybe push the chief a little bit more to the middle.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your columns. I always enjoyed reading them. Will we ever see the Supreme Court broadcast in real time?
Not anytime soon. I think, you know, any tendency in that direction, and I don't think there was much, I think was pretty permanently squelched after the argument in the first Affordable Care Act case, the first Obamacare argument, which the court put up the audio in not quite real time. They released it as soon as the argument was over. And if you remember that, Don Verrilli, President Obama's Solicitor General, got up to make his argument, and he took a sip of water, and it went down the wrong way, and he was kind of choking for a minute. And that was, of course, caught on the audio. That night, the Republican National Committee took that clip, they put it out as a commercial, as an ad, and they said, even the Obama administration's top lawyer choked when he had to get up and defend Obamacare, right? And when I became aware of that, and that sort of went viral on the internet, I said, okay, that's it. That is it. And so far, that's it. So I'm not holding my breath for television, though. Sir.
Hi. I want to ask your opinion on two things. One, just sort of in general, your opinion of whether there's a problem that stems from especially cable news, but other mostly TV news being divided, so politically divided. It's often pointed out that the TV news has become much more partisan than it was in the past. So just thinking about the independence of journalism and so forth, do you think is that true in your opinion, that it has become more partisan? And secondly, is that a problem? And then the other thing the other question I have relates to your comments about journalists in their private lives, and the idea that they certainly shouldn't give up their actions as citizens and thoughts of and opinions and so forth as journalists. But given your great experience with the Supreme Court, I wanted your opinion about the behavior of members of the court when it comes to expressing their opinions outside of the court. And I'm thinking especially, I guess, of Anthony Scalia and the many, many addresses that he has given around the country, in which he was extremely outspoken on subjects that were before the court and that would be expected to come before the court. Does that same sort of belief that journalists shouldn't, journalists should act as citizens and express their opinions in any way, even though they have a responsibility to keep their non-opinion journalism unbiased? Do you think that's that same sort of laissez-faire attitude about private life, does that extend to members of the court in general, and especially the Supreme Court?
Well, there are canons of judicial ethics that the court adheres to, even though as a technical matter they're not binding on the court. But Justice Scalia had to recuse himself, actually, when he expressed his opinion on matters that were before the court. The one I can think of was, I think this is right, when the Ninth Circuit held that the words "under God, one nation under God" and the Pledge of Allegiance violated the Establishment Clause, and Justice Scalia said something like, "That's ridiculous," whatever. And then the appeal reached the Supreme Court, and he had to recuse himself. So, there are limits, but obviously, these justices are picked because of who they are and what they believe, and you know, we don't expect them to pretend they come as blank slates. They're certainly not. You know, it's a fine line, like it's a fine line for all of us in the professions. It's pretty interesting, and you know, the court's in a tricky spot right now because, as I'm sure the justices are aware, although they don't always act as if they're aware of it, this is the first time in, I won't say ever, but certainly in the collective memory of everybody here, that the ideology of the justices maps precisely onto the politics of the president who appointed them. So the 5 most conservative members of the current court were all put there by Republican presidents, the 4 most liberal, all by Democratic presidents. That's not our tradition. I mean, Earl Warren was an Eisenhower appointee. William Brennan was an Eisenhower appointee. David Souter was the first President Bush. Harry Blackmun was Richard Nixon. So, you know, people could look at the court and not necessarily agree with the court, but the one thing they couldn't think is, oh, these justices are just carrying water for the party that brung them, right? And now that's not so much the case, and I think the court really needs to be careful about that. Your first question about the polarization of television news, I mean, it's obviously true, and obviously, you know, reflects the polarization of the country, and people watch the news that tells them the news they want to hear. And of course, when many of us in this room were growing up, and you know, you could pick one of the 3 networks, and news was curated by the anchors of each of the nightly news shows, and you know, so we all were getting the same thing. And you know, was that better? Yeah, I mean, I think it probably was. And you know, I can't offhand think of a cure for the current situation. Sir.
Tom Friedman was interviewed on Charlie Rose a week or so ago, and he made the comment that there's a 30% of the population which is going to basically believe anything the right wing tells them. Is there any way in this country that we can somehow get the truth across to that 30% and get them to think about maybe the right wing isn't telling the right story?
Boy, that is above my pay grade, and you know, I wish I had a kind of pundit's answer for that. I mean, I know there was a very interesting story in the Times a few weeks ago about a curriculum project in Italy, which, as I recall the story, has a kind of a nationally focused curriculum for school, public school. And the aim of this was starting at early grades to teach children how to tell real news from fake news, and to make them sophisticated from a young age at sorting this kind of stuff out. Who knows if that would work? I mean, certainly in this country we don't have national curriculums, but you know, anything's worth a try. But I wish I had the magic bullet.
Hi. I seriously thought of sitting down because
You seriously thought of what?
Sitting down because you just broached the question I was going to ask. But now you see the Supreme Court, especially thanks to the Senate and Trump being elected president, really being out of step with mainstream America. And it looks like that's only going to get worse if liberal justices step down. Do you think that would impact how the justices rule at all, or at least the opinion of the court?
Well, I'm not sure the court is out of step with mainstream America. It kind of depends how we define mainstream America. It's a very interesting question. The Gallup poll that came out about 6 weeks ago was very interesting, and it goes to your instinct. Said that for the first time in quite a long time, a majority of the public thinks the court is too conservative. In recent years, a majority has thought the court was too liberal, and that was after, you know, upholding Obamacare and you know, ruling for same-sex marriage. So people thought the court was too liberal. Now I think the Gorsuch nomination and the notion that, at least what Gallup seemed to think, was the notion that sort of every organ of our government now is under conservative control, has got the public a little concerned. That's really interesting. It hasn't gotten much attention, that poll, but I found it very interesting. So, you know, it just goes to the point. I mean, the court's always in some kind of dialogue with the public, obviously, is because of the public, the cases get up to the court. And when the court's out of step, greatly out of step with the sort of prevailing political winds, there's always a pushback, and politicians are very good at exploiting that. Richard Nixon ran against the Warren Court. I mean, he also ran against, the Civil Rights Revolution, and he ran against a lot of other kind of dog whistle type things, and he did it very successfully. And, that could happen again. Sure.
Well, we seem to have
Sorry,
reached
okay. You, and then I'll get back to you. So.
a new dimension. One can make an argument that the Merrick Garland caper and the current push to put lawyers and judges onto the federal court system who decades ago might have been considered their views too extreme to get support in the Senate, to get confirmation, puts our federal judiciary in a serious damage. And I'm wondering, is there anything that you can think of that could be useful? Are we really in a death spiral in our democracy? That's my question.
Other than the Democrats taking back the Senate in 2018, that's the magic bullet. Because as things are going, the president's made, I think, something like 50 or 60 nominations to the federal courts so far, very rapid pace. And they're getting confirmed at a very rapid pace. There's no more filibuster. They're just getting automatically confirmed. A number of them are by traditional credentials highly qualified. Many of them are former Supreme Court law clerks, all for Justice Scalia or Justice Thomas, granted, but, all very well educated. Nobody can point at them and say, he's not qualified. But they're all vetted by conservative think tanks and so on. And there's nothing the Democrats can do to stop it other than getting more Democrats in the Senate. So, sure.
So I don't know whether this is good news or bad news, but I just read a biography of John Quincy Adams, and the press in those days was so scurrilous that when Adams ran for re-election, Clay and Webster, who were supporting him, found, the Cincinnati Enquirer or some newspaper that was reporting that Andy Jackson had married a prostitute, that he was, engaged in various insurrections and treason, and, this stuff was reported, and on the other side there were newspapers saying terrible things about Adams and how he wanted to give the country back to Great Britain. We have a long history of very both partisan and unscrupulous journalism in the United States. So, cable news now is really no different from what we had almost from the founding, right?
Yeah.
Or at the founding.
Was there a question buried in there?
No, I just thought that, I'd like your reaction to that.
I think what you say is historically correct. Yes, sure, Mr. Clymer.
I wanted to come back to your book.
Thank you.
And the ideas of journalists not giving up their rights as citizens. How far should they go, and do you think journalists ought to go in showing what they think about issues, particularly people who have a hard news assignment?
I've always thought, and people tend not to agree with me, that I think reporters should be judged by their published work and by the clips and by what resides and what they care to do or say offline, if you will, I think is their own business. And I know that's a provocative stance. And I know that in the current day of everybody having a Twitter feed, mainstream journalism, including very recently the Times, is trying to put out rules for that, and that I get because I'm not on any social media on purpose, but I think if somebody is tweeting as a New York Times reporter here's what I really think about this. You know, I think that's an issue of legitimate concern to the paper. But I think when someone is off duty, my personal view is they have a right to do and say what they care to. But thank you for asking.
Well, it's sort of about the book.
Sure.
It's never bothered me particularly that the Supreme Court rules that state legislatures, state laws are unconstitutional, and that's a required function. But it really grabs me that when just one person decides that the constitutional opinions of the Congress and the President, that one person can overrule their that function, just one person. And I'm wondering, is it possible that by its own rule, the Supreme Court could establish a rule or a practice of having an abstention or whatever, so that it required at least 6 votes to make unconstitutional an act of Congress? Or is there any other way to address that issue?
I actually think in some constitutional democracies there are rules like that, actually. So it's not a, it's not a ridiculous idea by any means, but it certainly hasn't been our system. It would have to be by, I think, internal agreement of the justices that unless we have a supermajority, we're not going to issue an opinion that does X. It would be a change in our judicial culture, but who's to say? I mean, it's interesting. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Good evening. So I'm an attorney in Michigan, but I'm here in D.C. merely as a tourist, and I'm planning to see oral argument tomorrow morning and hopefully again on Tuesday. And I'm just wondering if you can give any insights on what to watch for, maybe with the new composition of the court, or the questions if you happen to be familiar with what they are tomorrow and Tuesday.
I would go on the court's website. Well, I would go on a website called SCOTUS blog.
Okay.
See what's being argued tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
Look those cases up on SCOTUS blog. You'll see all the briefs.
Okay.
Because to listen to a Supreme Court argument without having read the briefs, you have no idea what's happening, because the case is never set out, the case is never described.
Okay.
The argument starts right in the middle. It's the background knowledge is assumed by everybody, all the actors in this process. And so unless you know what's up, you're wasting your time. That's my advice.
Great. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yes.
Hi, thank you for coming. I really appreciate it. I have a question about the he said, she said thing.
A question about
the he said, she said. Okay. So say it's about voters' rights, and I'm the reporter and I'm writing about it, and should I be, it's very rare or unlikely that there's voter fraud, and are you suggesting that I would say, they're arguing this, but it's so rare? I mean, that we would kind of state.
Yes, exactly. I mean,
yeah.
If I can find the actual reference here. Wait a minute. Not sure. I can't find it.
That's okay.
But I would cite a recent decision out of the, I think, Federal District Court in Texas that struck down some iteration of this long-running Texas voter ID case. It said something like there have been 12 million votes cast in Texas in the past 5 years or something like that. And there have been, 5 questionable ID problems or something out of 12 million. And just, you don't have to sort of get up on a moral high horse about it, but just give the facts.
Right, there's objective data on that. In this particular instance, there's objective data. I guess I have a question about the Len Downey idea of, first of all, I'm not sure I believe whether he could completely eliminate opinions from his personhood.
That's what the man said.
Yeah, and then I would have a lot of questions about his veracity. I mean, like his credibility as an individual on some level that he would be actually able to do that. I just don't think that's humanly possible.
I never met the man, and I have a high regard for him, but I just
it just
doesn't strike me as a goal that one should aspire to, which is to rid your mind of thoughts.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, it is a goal if you're like a Zen Buddhist and whatever, but maybe not for the reporter. I guess my question would be if someone's saying that, but clearly, I mean, don't people's opinions come through, seep out regardless? I mean,
no, I don't think so. Actually.
No. You think that we're capable of holding those?
No, I mean, it's part of the the skill.
Of a reporter.
To not. I mean, I never thought in my daily reporting job that I was telling people what to think. I hoped that I was empowering them to think for themselves and to draw their own informed conclusion. And frankly, I don't think I had any problem ever keeping my own opinion out of my stories. And for most stuff I wrote about, I didn't have an opinion. Most cases that come to the court come because the lower courts are divided on the issue, and a lot of very smart people have just come to different conclusions, and I didn't have I didn't go to the work of forming an opinion. But I think any good journalist does not have a problem with that, actually. Yes.
Yes, on the he said, she said, as you described it. I knew somebody once, a minister in the South. He happened to be Methodist, but his view was that he didn't vote because he said he believed in rendering unto Caesar that which was Caesar's and rendering unto God that which was God's, and he felt that he only had but so much to render, and therefore. But,
I wish all ministers were like that.
Well, that's what he that's what he said, but as a practical matter, he was exceedingly conservative in matters of actually everything but race, interestingly, but where all sorts of issues, social issues, he was exceedingly conservative. The other, so I think it's exceedingly difficult to truly to be objective, as Len Downey was advocating. The other thing I would say is that I'm reminded of kind of the hearsay rule, which, so I think maybe we were listening to the same public radio piece regarding voter ID on the way here, but the very fact that people contend that, particularly these days, Republicans are contending that voter fraud is the issue. Therefore, all sorts of restrictions need to be applied when, in fact, there's so very little evidence of voter fraud. Isn't a reporter's duty or job really to say, well, given that this is what people are saying, the hearsay rule, it's not the truth of the matter asserted, it's that the person said it. And that is the fact to be emphasized and as an investigative reporter or a reporter of any sort to try to penetrate it and explore it and investigate it.
Well, that's right. I mean, I do talk about that sort of in those terms, that, simply quoting somebody accurately, saying something that's not true, you can't be accused of misquoting them. You're quoting them, but yet you're projecting without question. You're kind of attesting to it by the fact that, without question, you're putting it out there as the other side of the story, and that's what's a problem. Okay.
Thank you.
In kind of a follow-up, thank you. I still hear the press release behavior of reporters versus someone doing the contextual, deeper study that says no resident of the United States has to prove they haven't committed a crime. We don't need to prove we're not committing a fraud when we vote. You have to prove, government, you have to prove that I've committed a crime. I don't have to prove that I've not committed a crime. And to have no reporter do any kind of a thing like that, it still sounds to me like it's just press releases from this side, that side. He said, she said.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. That's my beef. Right. Yeah.
Hi, how are you? You mentioned Planned Parenthood early in your presentation.
I mentioned what?
Planned Parenthood.
Uh-huh.
As a writer, just wanted to get your take on Margaret Sanger, because I've read articles about her connection with eugenics and her not being so enamored with the black population.
My opinion of Margaret Sanger. Well, again, it's, you know, I don't like to expound on things that I can't claim expertise on. You know, that's an allegation that's been thrown at Margaret Sanger for many years, and I haven't personally investigated it. Okay, maybe last question? Okay.
What do you think about, it seems like the press in reporting everything that Trump says or does, you know, a lot of that doesn't really have significance, you know, like, for example, I can't even think of a specific example, but like if he makes a comment about Britney Spears, who cares, right? Because it's not really relevant to anything. I mean, is the press, I personally feel a lot of fatigue by hearing every single, you know, ridiculous thing that he says or does. And I just really wonder if the press couldn't focus more on whatever is actually relevant to his job and maybe some of the more egregious things. But, you know, there's so much else that we hear about. And is it really news?
Well, you know, I mean, it's kind of government by tweet. So, you know, it's by tweet that he says we're not going to have transgender people in the military. It's by, you know, tweet that he says I want the death penalty for this defendant. So it's, I think it's a little tricky to ignore what in the usual context would seem trivial. But that's how he's governing. So I don't think there's a solution to it. Thank you very much for coming.